have the principals, filmmakers, as part of the conversation. But I think, like everybody else, our attention is diverted at the moment by the attention we're paying to the Derek Chauvin trial and to the funeral today, the funeral of young Dante Wright, going on right now in North Minneapolis. I want to proceed and in a minute bring up some of my lawyer panel. I'm pleased to be connecting again today with Dean Burnell Venable Powell, former dean or dean emeritus of the University of South Carolina Law School, with Clinton Collins, who is corporate counsel for the Geico Corporation here in Twin Cities, and who, along with me, served on the board and served as board chairs of the Minneapolis Urban League, and our friend and colleague, brother Kamau King, joining us from Atlanta, retired corporate counsel at the Coca-Cola Company. We want to continue the discussion we've been having for the past several Thursdays, looking at me interviewing them and asking them to provide analysis of what's going on in the trial. And so we'll do some music when we come back. I know that Clinton and Kamau are both here. We're waiting for Professor Powell to join. After the music break, we'll come back and start that conversation. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. I'm Al McFarlane. That's the music of Sounds of Blackness, Twin Cities' own music organization. The music's so timely. Sick and Tired of Being Sick and Tired captures the feeling of a lot of us, I believe, here and around the country. I continue with conversations with Al McFarlane. I'm going to build on the interviews we've done in the past several weeks with a team of esteemed lawyers. I call them legal experts who, with me, are analyzing the Derek Chauvin trial and associated items, issues with that. Pleased to have my colleague, friend from way back, I think third grade, Kamal J. King, an attorney who is joining us from Atlanta. He's retired as a corporate counsel for Coca-Cola Company, and then here in Twin Cities, my friend and person that I've done business with, corporate wise, Clinton Collins, who's corporate counsel for the Geico Corporation, and we'll be joined momentarily by third attorney, Professor Dean Burnell Powell, Emeritus Dean of the University of South Carolina Law School. Let me start by Kamal King, by Clinton, asking you to sort of give a recap. We started this trial, a month ago now? And if you would kind of go back through what happened over the course from the beginning and what we concluded with the verdict a couple of days ago. And you're on mute right now, Clinton, I think, to unmute your mic.
Now,
there we go. Yeah, perfectly.
Well, okay, what happened was when the trial first started, they went through a process of jury selection, which is called voir dire. And each side got so many strikes or opportunities to eliminate jurors they didn't think would be fair. And that lasted several days, given it's such a high-profile case. The prosecution, clearly wanted to get people who were not going to automatically believe the police just because they were police, and the defense wanted to get people who were not going to automatically condemn them. And I think on balance, they ended up with a pretty fair jury. It was pretty racially balanced. There were people of color, there were women, there were men, and I think the juries ended up being pretty representative of this community. After the voir dire selection was done, then the trial itself started. Each side made its opening statements and explained what they wanted to do during the trial, and then they went into testimony. The prosecution went first. They presented their witnesses, and as the country saw, they had a number of expert witnesses. They had the eyewitnesses who were there at the scene, and most critically was the video taken by the at the time 17-year-old teenager, which was probably the star witness of the whole case. I don't think it would have got to where it did, and I don't think we would have had the outcome we did without that video. Then and after each prosecution witness, the defense had the opportunity to cross-examine, ask questions. And then at the conclusion of the prosecution's case, it was the defense's turn to present their position. They didn't have as many experts, and what they were trying to do was to sow reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury that in order for the jury to convict Derek Chauvin, there had to be a unanimous decision by everybody, all 12 members. And if even one person had dissented, it could have resulted in a hung jury, which means that there was not a consensus, and then the prosecution would have had the option of either dismissing the case or trying it again. And then after the conclusion of the defense's case, the judge gave the jury their instructions. He went through the law and what the standards were. And then each side made their closing argument. The prosecution went first, and then the defense went, and then the prosecution, because they had the burden of proof. In other words, they were the ones who have to prove that Chauvin was guilty. Chauvin did not have to prove he was innocent, but that the prosecution had to prove he was guilty. They got the last word, and then the jury deliberated, and they reached a verdict, and they found Derek Chauvin guilty in all 3 counts he was charged with, which was murder in the 2nd degree, murder in the 3rd degree, and manslaughter. And so now Chauvin has been taken into custody. My understanding, he's in Stillwater Prison out in Oak Park Heights and awaiting sentencing, which will happen in about 8 weeks. In the meantime, the judge will do what's known or receive what's known as a pre-sentencing investigation, in which there will be people who will look into Derek Chauvin's background, his history, and come up with recommendations as to what his background suggests in terms of punishment. And then the judge will sentence him. And then at that point, he will start to serve a sentence. And Chauvin, if he chooses, and I'm almost certain he will, can bring an appeal. So kind of in a nutshell, that's what has happened and what is going to happen in the next several weeks.
When the sentencing takes place, Clinton Collins, the defense might bring character witnesses or people that have known him to influence how the judge will mete out the sentence. Will that be a time when the family also gets a chance to do a family impact statement? So if they want to see a stiffer penalty, at least their voices, their point of view is on the record?
Yes, there is. And also, if people between now and the sentencing, if people were to send letters of support on Chauvin's behalf, they could do that. And that often happens, where there'll be people in the community who will vouch for, in their opinion, his character, his positive character, at least they would argue that, or plea for mercy or leniency on the part of the court, which the court has the discretion to give whatever weight to it they choose. I mean, they can take it into significant, give it a higher significance, or they can just disregard it. Again, it's up to the court, meaning the judge, ultimately to decide what he's going to do, and then he will issue a sentence.
It is likely that friends and supporters of Chauvin, or of the police in general, will mount a letter writing campaign, isn't it, and try to flood the books with documents that they hope will mitigate some of the sentencing. Likewise, is there likely a similar outpouring of correspondence from families or people part of the victim's family? Does that happen?
Yes, all to the above. But in this case, I don't think, I mean, Chauvin, I'm sure will receive some letters, but I don't think it'll be as much as you would expect. And what's really telling was, during the trial, he had a seat reserved in the courtroom for anyone that he wanted to designate to attend, family members, supporters. Most of the time during the trial, that seat was empty. And there's been recent polls, one done by the USA Today just shortly after the verdict, that over 75% of the country, across political lines, across racial lines, supported the verdict. So the point I'm making is that I don't think he's going to receive a lot of letters. There will be some, but this is one case in which the police themselves, as evidenced by the testimony of Chief Arredondo, the other officers that testified, the lack of commentary by police unions across the country, I don't think he's going to be getting an avalanche of support letters.
Kamal King, thank you for joining us. Good to see you again, my friend. Question I have is, where were you when the verdict was being read, and what went through your mind? How did you put all this together based on our conversations and your knowledge of the law and your study, of what happens in the judicial legal process?
Yeah, first, thank you again for inviting me. And Clinton, that was an excellent recap of what occurred, what's been occurring for the last month. Good job. For me, I was driving Miss Carolyn, my wife, to a mall. When the news came on, we were listening to NPR, and when the news came on that the jury had reached a decision, and I immediately told my wife that less than 24 hours, he's guilty. Now, what he's guilty of, but they have decided that he is guilty. That during the closing arguments for the defense, I felt as though the defense attorney was pointing or directing his arguments to one or two people on that jury who he may have thought were on his side. And when they came back in less than 24 hours, I had the strong feeling that he was going to be found guilty. So, and when he was, I was relieved. I was relieved. Yeah.
When you think, and as you talk to your friends and colleagues and people that you come in contact with in the community, what feedback are you getting? What is the sense of the community? And I ask that because when the incident, the murder itself unfolded a year ago, there was a spark, not only in Twin Cities, but across the country. And I think your city was one of the cities that went into a massive disruption behind the incident and protest. And so any sense of how Atlanta was feeling? In fact, I got a call from a friend of yours and mine, the owners of the one of the Black Atlanta newspapers, Janice Ware, asking me, this is moments before the verdict, are you all set? And what's going to happen? And how does it feel? And so a colleague in the publishing industry, the Black press, was concerned and called to see how it felt up here, suggesting the feelings existed there as well. What do you think?
Yeah, same. The feedback that I received was kind of frightening to me, in the sense that people were saying that if it had not been a guilty verdict, that there would have been problems. There would have been a lot of problems, and that's not what I wanted. I don't see that as being an advantage to the protesters, to the people who felt that he was guilty, rioting and things of that nature. But those were the feedbacks. That's the feedback I was getting, that if he was not found guilty, that it was going to be a lot of problems. But I felt more like the problem would have been the how people in the world viewed America. When you have this kind of evidence, and if you'd have walked away, like in the Rodney King verdict, I thought it would have been just a shame for the United States of America. Let me say this too. It took the young lady actually filming the murder, police officers coming to testify against this man, and we were still on edge as regard to what the jury was going to do. To me, that speaks volumes about the support that police get in this country.
Great comment. Her name, let's say it, Darnella Frazier, 17 at the time, maybe 18 now, but I think kudos to her. And she is an example of both awareness and fortitude, for her to stand there in that tense moment and keep focused on what was unfolding before us, documenting that for the world. And I recall that this past 2 weeks ago, when Dante Wright was killed, you could hear, and we've reported that officers continually told people around him to shut down their video. So there were efforts to not record what was happening in Brooklyn Center. And so, to think that young Darnella Frazier had the presence of mind and the courage to stand there and document that, I think is commendable and noteworthy. I think that's really important. So we talked about this last week, but for this video, would there be the prosecution and the conviction that we've seen? What do you think?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Explain that, though. Expand on that.
Well, you look at, there has been police brutality against Black people ever since we've been in this country. And generally speaking, the police have gotten away with it. But the video evidence was so clear and it was direct. And when the jury saw it, they were able to see for themselves what happened. And visuals are always more powerful than just a dialogue. And it was much harder for the police to sustain an alternative reality. I was looking at a story just recently that reviewed the initial press release that the Minneapolis police put out after this happened back last May. And in the initial press release, they indicated that words to the effect that George Floyd had a medical condition and he died while they were trying to arrest him. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially they described something that on the surface appeared sad but pretty benign, which is far different than what actually happened. And if the video hadn't existed, you would have had the police officers' testimony against that of the witnesses. And as we've seen countless times, the police are believed over lay people, especially a white police officer over largely Black witnesses, almost every single time. But this video was so graphic and so horrific that it was virtually impossible, at least from a political point of view, for state authorities to ignore it. Whereas if there had just been testimony, they could have said, hey, he said, she said. And again, looking at my own experience as a prosecutor, police are believed. They are believed the vast majority of the time. This was one case in which it was very clear that the narrative they put out initially was false on its face.
Will there be a requirement or a request from the community to now examine all cases that involved Derek Chauvin? On one of the national television shows, the former head of the Minneapolis NAACP, Leslie Redmond, said that the Chauvin was a serial killer. That's what she called him. That he'd been involved in several incidents that led to or resulted in the death of citizens, and that he had a number of charges. I think the number was in the teens, most of which were dismissed, but they were filed for excessive use of force. So one of the California commentators on CNN, I think she was a police officer, said this is a time for the city or the court to go back and review all of the cases that were investigated and that charges were brought in based on the work of Derek Chauvin, because he's now proven himself to be a liar and now a convicted felon, and that puts all of his prior activity in a different light. Is that realistic? Is that how it's looked at in the courts? I see Brunel Venable Powell is with us now. Thank you, cousin, for joining the program again. Let me throw that to you first of all. What are the rules, and what do people be expecting and thinking about when they look at after this conviction, the work that Chauvin had done before in his capacity as an officer of the law?
Well, I guess that was directed at me, and
yes.
Glad to be with you. I would expect a number of lawyers, those who have been defense counsel in prior cases, ask for a review of the cases. And I would also expect for them essentially to join together and act as a class, seeking a review of all cases in which he's been involved. Just today, I think it was in New York that I'm not sure if he was the county prosecutor, whether he was the county prosecutor, but one of the chief law enforcement officers there, the chief prosecutors, asked that there be a review of all convictions involving women who have been prosecuted in connection with prostitution and other sex crimes over the last 10 or 15 years. Well, that's a suggestion that this kind of thing is not totally unusual. It does happen from time to time that prosecutors reach a point that they say we no longer have confidence in the witnesses or the participants in the prior prosecution, and we'd like for them to be reviewed. So I think that this is a case that calls out for that there should be such a review. But before we go too far, I would like to go back and pick up a point that Clinton was speaking to, but let me stop here and let you have it. Well, maybe.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. That point. You put the question of whether this would have been a conviction absent the video, and I certainly do not want to say that this is a time for celebration because we secured this conviction. It is, I think, way over the top to celebrate the fact that someone is convicted given the evidence that was available in this case. I mean, this was not simply beyond a reasonable doubt. This was a conviction based on evidence that was beyond any doubt. So it does seem to me that even while we are celebrating, that there is an opportunity here to ask legitimately the question that you put. Would have been a conviction absent the video evidence? And I would simply like to suggest that while we can't be totally sure one way or another, there are at least a few developments that we ought to give their fair due. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, which made it put the federal government in the position of overseeing changes in voting rights, has had a profound effect. We are not living in the same world today as we were prior to 1965. The fact that Attorney General Ellison was the one who was prosecuting this case. This means that you got an African American who is in a powerful position there in Minnesota, specifically involved in this case. And the fact that we had a diverse jury. In fact, the jury in this case was more diverse than juries normally are in Minnesota. Half the people on the jury were people of color. And I also would not dismiss the fact that you had a dream team prosecution in this case. Some of those individuals came out of a very successful, lucrative private practice in order to come back and work with the public sector to this prosecution. So while I'm not saying that this is something that we need to celebrate because the facts are very unusual, but I don't think that we want to miss this as an opportunity to say that people of color have been pushing very hard for a very long time, and some of the evidence of that pushing is available to us in this case.
Dean Powell, one of the things that you said in a previous conversation was that the lens through which we should be viewing this is one that where we ask the question, what would have happened in this trial 20 years ago? What would have happened 10 years ago? And therefore, it gives us some sense of the importance and the progress that we've made reflected in what's happening right now. But even this is insufficient. What's more important is to look at the next case and the next case and the next case, and therein establish a sense of trend, movement towards genuine inclusion and justice that we say we stand for. Expand on that thought, if you would.
Well, I think that we are still several years away from being able to take the true measure of this case. This is a case, I think we would all agree, involved overwhelming evidence. And it also was a case that became an international cause célèbre. The whole world was watching how Minnesota was going to handle this case, how Minnesota, as a representative of the United States, was going to handle this case. And so there are a lot of unique features here. But over time, what we've got to see is whether the standard that is applicable is being applied not just in Minnesota, but in Missouri and in New York and in Alabama and in New Mexico and California. And until we have that evidence before us, I don't think that we can really say that we've had a breakthrough.
Kamal, jump in. Go ahead, Collins.
One thing I was going to add from the previous question about reopening Chauvin's cases, the Department of Justice, our Attorney General Merrick Garland, announced yesterday that there was going to be a full-scale Justice Department investigation of the Minneapolis police force to examine everything, their operations, their practices. And I think in the course of that, what Chauvin has done will certainly be examined. And the lasting impact of that is that, assuming that the investigation does go forward, and there's no doubt that it will, that the Justice Department will come up with a series of recommendations, and there could very likely be called a consent decree, which is basically a settlement agreement between the government and whoever they're investigating that will be enforced by the court, that they have to do certain things in a certain time frame. And there are a number of other police departments in the country, Seattle, for example, that is under a consent decree. In other words, that they had problems, there was an investigation, the judicial system got involved, and in order to resolve it, they were forced to basically sign a contract that we will do certain things. And I think in the course of that one, everything that Chauvin ever touched will be looked at. And then beyond that, the federal government will be watching Minneapolis very closely. And I think that's one impact that perhaps people don't fully appreciate is going to be significant, perhaps for years to come, because there will be federal independent oversight of the Minneapolis Police Department with real accountability, and that doesn't exist right now, or hasn't up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's going to be, it's going to go beyond Minnesota. I think that this Black Lives Matter movement and the focus is on the police, that any police killing of Black people now anywhere in the United States is going to be looked at. And I think that the chiefs of police, you know, they're probably lecturing their people now, you know, that, you know, we don't want this here. We don't want that here. I think that the camera is on them. It's on the police. One of the things that this trial has done, that you spoke to, Mr. Collins, is that in the past, whatever police said were accepted. If you were in a trial, whatever police said was accepted. And I don't think that that's going to be as much the case from this point forward, that now people may begin to question.
Well, more specifically, white people will begin to question. We always knew what was going on.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that was interesting was the way in which the police chief in, I guess, Columbus, Ohio, responded in terms of this latest shooting of Makila Bryant, the 16-year-old. He immediately released the videotape. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that was interesting about that was that he apparently had ordered his officers to begin, not only to begin wearing the cameras, but to turn them on before they arrive at the scene, and to do that with respect to all cases that officers were responding to. So we are beginning to see some changes. Now, in that particular instance, all of those changes were not in response to the Floyd case, but they are indicators of what you're saying, Kamal, that changes are beginning to take place here.
I've got two concerns to bring up, two ideas that I wanted particularly Burnell and Kamal to respond to, because I sent emails to you both and you both responded. When we grew up in Kansas City, there was a cop named Big Red. I don't know his real name, but I presume that he was an Irishman, that he was a big guy. I know I saw him when I was a kid. And I think the three of us would have always walked to school together and walked home together every day, or walked to the Carver Theater for the summer movies that they had when school was out, and walked back home. We lived, you and I lived in the same house, your dad's house, Burnell, or either next door to you, and Kamal lived a block down the street. So we were, together all the time. So I remember stories in our neighborhood about Big Red. And the story that I remember was that he would stop black men, even black kids, and take them out in the country, question them, and then drop them off, make them walk home. But that's intimidation at minimum. Looking back, it's a form of terrorism against black kids and black people. Do you guys remember that at all? And how you put our experience, bring that experience into how we analyze what we see in the court and legal and justice system today? Burnell, what do you think?
Well, Big Red was one of my first encounters with the police. It was not a direct encounter. It was indirect, but at a very young age, I had to be less than 10 years of age. I remember him driving up in the police car and jumping out and yelling, "All right, you Negroes," and he wasn't saying Negroes, "get back into your holes." And this was one of the memories growing up that is sheared into my consciousness. I can't unsee that event, and I've replayed it, over the decades. That, I think, is not an unusual picture of how blacks in this country have viewed the police.
Kamal, any memory or thoughts of that or similar?
Yeah, I remember the name Big Red. As a matter of fact, I had forgot about it until you guys brought it back up. That's one of the things I didn't want to remember. But the case that I remember that changed my view of not only police but of the media was a black man in Kansas City was running from the police in his car. They were chasing him, and they stopped him on the corner of Prospect and Truman Road. And it was at noon or so, and that's when this is back in the 60s when there was programs, all kind of programs. So there was a lot of kids out at that place. And when he stopped his car, he got out of the car, put his hands up, and the police lit into him like Rodney King. And the news reporters were there. And they had their cameras, but they had them down. They would not record what was going on. And that let me know at that point that, wow, this is a conspiracy that is systematic, that that they're working together. So,
Well, so that's a great point. And the point it brings to me is this, and I'm thinking of it in terms of, number one, elevating and advancing strategy for justice and the pursuit of justice from our community and in the public space. I'm thinking back to the tactic of the civil rights movement to use the national press to bring attention to the institutional and structural disadvantage Black communities felt throughout the South. And the object of Freedom Summer was as much as it was to put pressure against those racist institutions in the South, it was also to let the rest of the world know how entrenched these practices were, that this was something that was part of the culture. And it was the bringing of a national light to this cancer that began to bring healing to it. And in that light, people like, I think in particular, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and others talked about internationalizing awareness of the civil rights movement, that part of our mission and story would be in letting the entire world know. Paul Robeson, for example, and others like him talked about revealing the truth of our experience because America had a double mind. On the one hand, it proposed and held up these principles of equality, liberty, pursuit of justice for all, but the reality beneath that was founded on the proposition of the denial of the humanity of African people. And so how do you expose that contradiction in a way that has consequence and that makes it less likely for our national society to contain the contradiction and move forward because we've exposed the contradiction? So throwing it out as a general proposition, is there a strategy here with the Darnella Fraziers that we can be intentional about, where we train ourselves to understand the power, the reach, and the ability to connect to global audiences via social media, and thereby bring incessant pressure and incessant accountability to police forces and to ourselves? What do you think? Clinton, you first.
Well, Al, I think you answered your own question. I mean, the answer was within the question. Basically, Ms. Frazier made it clear to everybody that we all have the tools at our disposal to hold police accountable if we're willing to take the risk and stick our necks out a little bit. I don't know what the exact number is of the percentage of Americans that have cell phones. I'm sure it's well into the 90s. And cell phones today are very sophisticated. Right now, I'm participating in this program on my cell phone. And, again, Ms. Frazier showed the power, as if it needed to be reemphasized, of a visual image. And it's clear, even though the police may not like to be videotaped, they can't stop it from happening. They cannot, that as a citizen, if you want to videotape something, and as long as you're not actively obstructing what they're doing, you have the absolute right to do so. And I think that the police realize that most Americans are aware of that now. And I think most Americans are aware that they have the right to videotape. And I think the point you made about using that to keep people accountable, that's what it comes down to, is accountability. And the reason why Black people have been abused for so long was that there are not sufficient tools in place, or at least the will to use them and enforce their use to hold people accountable. And in this particular instance, the video that she took was compelling, and it directly contradicted what the police officer said initially in this report, which was just a flat out lie. And so ultimately, we all have to step up. And I think historically, I'm talking about Black people in particular, we would often complain about things privately, but not be willing to take a stand publicly. I mean, obviously, there have been many exceptions, but now Darnella has shown us that everybody has the ability and the tools, if they're willing to use them, to hold the people in power accountable and to be willing to report them when they engage in bad conduct.
Dean Powell, what are your thoughts? And I have a question to ask you after you respond to this one.
I'm thinking, look to Georgia. Right now, Georgia is as good an example of the way forward as we have ever seen in the history of this nation. As a result of people of color and people of conscience coming together in a coalition, they were able to elect the first Black as a senator in Georgia and the first Jew as a senator in Georgia. That didn't happen by accident. That's a product of investment and hard work. And while it is certainly the case that our international allies are important to us, and they ought to be brought into the conversation whenever it's feasible. I think that African Americans, we've got to get to a point in which we are, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way, but get to a point where we recognize that we as a people are the most prosperous, the best educated, the best organized people of color, probably in the history of the world. I mean, the reason why the Republican Party is working so hard to deny Blacks and people of color the right to vote is not accidental. They recognize that the agenda that they have for the nation cannot stand in the face of organized, persistent confrontation by people of color in coalition with people of conscience.
I've seen it, man. The Black people in the United States are, other than the Black people in South Africa themselves, we are the reason that turned around. The boycotts that we precipitated and made sure that happened of South Africa. And my only statement is that lies don't live forever.
That's right.
I believe that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. I believe those two things. And I think that by and by, as our parents would say, by and by, things are going to get better.
And so I'm looking at the notion of acceleration, that we're moving through technology to being able to do things differently, more expansively, with more impact because of technology and because everything builds on what existed before. How do we see that process of acceleration advancing our move towards our own freedom? But I connect that and say that's a bellwether for human freedom, starting with that within the American culture and society, but not limited to that, rather something that's global and universal. What do you think, Burnell?
Well, you remind me that futurists, people who study the possible futures that we might play out, are fond of saying, and public policy analysts have adopted this too. They're fond of saying that T equal or tomorrow equals T plus one, meaning today plus something else. Always building. The future always depends upon building on what you have today, and so. Just as when Obama was running for president, he would say, don't get mad, vote. Don't shout, vote. Stacey Abrams, don't get mad, don't get angry, vote. Organize, get out there. So I think that that is the direction in which we're moving. Technology has allowed communications among people of color and people of conscience uh, in a way that has not been available before. We can get the story out there. We can uh, uh, frame the agenda. We can bring about the future that we want and know that we need.
Clinton Collins, where and what is the resistance to our movement from your perspective as a player in corporate America and as a person who's practiced in the courts? Where is there resistance to this idea of the respect of our humanity, the recognition of the dignity that is inherent? And you might know our friend here. We both are on the board together with the Urban League. Peter Hayden, Dr. Hayden, and in an interview with him recently, he was describing the question of what it is that white people fear about Black people trying to be themselves. I'm not saying it the way he said it, but you can catch the drift of his rhetorical question. That there is, from his point of view, something that is irrationally and fearful in white culture at the thought of Black people bringing their authentic selves to any arena, conversation, environment. Clinton, what do you think?
I think Dr. Hayden was onto something. I believe it's a fear of loss of power and loss of status. I read several articles that talk about the psychic wage that white people receive from being in a superior position. When you look especially at the South, poor whites and Blacks would have been a natural coalition. But the ruling class of white people were able to tell the less affluent whites, look, you have a certain status being a white person, and that it really had value. And so because they believed in that psychic value, they were willing to accept poor economic conditions and to not look out for their own economic interests, because in their mind, they were getting paid through the psychic value of white superiority. And I think in corporate America, you see that as well. It's particularly from white males, and particularly the older white males. One thing I will say is that I'd say white males under the age of, I'd say 35 or so, are not quite as resistant because, quite frankly, they grew up in a different world. But people my age, I'm 62 years old, white males, they feel threatened because, again, they perceive this loss of status, this psychic value, and they believe that any gains that Black people make comes at their expense, not realizing that there is an overstructure above them that's manipulating the whole thing. There's one cartoon I saw real quickly. It summarizes the whole situation. It had three people in the cartoon. There was a person of color on one side of the table. He had no cookie on his plate. There was a working class white guy that had one cookie on his plate. And then Murdoch was sitting with a whole plate full of cookies. And he says to the white guy, that immigrant, that Black person wants your cookie. And so rather than the poor white guy thinking, you've got a dozen cookies, no, he's going to go after the poor Black person because he's taking his one cookie. And I just thought that captures it.
Works.
Yeah, that gets the whole picture. And so I think whoever is in power, and unfortunately, ironically, having an old white guy as president places him in a position to address that myth head on and to say that, as Paul Wellstone used to say, we all do better when we all do better. And improving a lot of people of color is not going to diminish you. It will place you in a better position. And my company, Geico, has been working on seminars to make white men realize that they're part of the diversity picture and that it will help them as well. And that ultimately, they had to realize and buy into it's in everyone's self-interest for everyone to do better.
Yeah.
We're almost at the end of the hour. I want to go around the table one more time just to get concluding thoughts. And in those concluding thoughts, two things. Having now closed the three things, having now closed this phase of the Derek Chauvin trial, any impressions on the sentencing that happens in about 8 weeks from now? Number two, it's one thing. Two, what does the result of this trial hold for the trials coming up of the three other officers that were involved and charged in the death of George Floyd? That's number two. Number three, the funeral is going on right now, but charges have been placed against the officer, Kim Potter, who shot and killed Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center. That trial looms. And then the last thing is, how do you look at the shooting yesterday, Burnell, that you referred to in Ohio, where an officer, it appears, arrived at a time where life-threatening conditions existed and made a decision to use deadly force? How do we look at that? How does that look in the context of today's conversation and today's attention? So take any part of that and jump into it, or none of it. I'm going to end with you, Burnell Powell. Start with Clinton, then Kamal, then we'll close with Professor Powell.
I appreciate your starting with Clinton.
So any thoughts on any of that, Clinton? What are you thinking?
Well, as for the sentencing, Chauvin will not receive the maximum penalty because he's a first-time offender.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the pre-sentence investigation, we'll go through all of his background. He's going to do time, but it's not going to be the maximum sentence for the most serious crime is 40 years. It's not going to be 40 years, but he's going to get somewhere between 12 and 20 years, I would guess. And likely he will start the sentence immediately. He'll be sentenced on each of the charges, but they will probably run concurrently and not consecutively. In other words, they're not going to charge him 20 years for this, 10 years for that, 5 years for this, and add it all up. It'll be a concurrent sentence. And I think he'll remain in Stillwater, and I think he'll remain in some kind of secure unit like he is right now, because quite frankly, I think if he were in the general population, he'd be dead in a week.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I agree with Clinton with regard to the sentence. With regard to the case that happened, the police officer came up and shot the woman. That would not be a case where I think we should spend a lot of energy on. She had a knife. She was attacking another person, and a police officer is within his rights if he or someone else is being threatened. And that was definitely the situation as far as the facts are revealing themselves now. So I wouldn't spend a lot of energy on that one.
But let me push back, Kamal. I mean, aren't there cases we're seeing where somehow, and I'm not, well, somehow police are able,
Dylan Roof killed 9 people.
Yep.
He was captured, not killed, stopped to get a hamburger along the way to the jail.
That's the point.
I understand what you're saying.
Yep.
I do understand what you're saying. But when you look at the law against the facts, I believe that the police officer will get off on that one.
Okay.
And it's unfortunate.
I think that the case involving Miss Bryant, the 16-year-old, the child, and the case involving Dylan Wright are both really difficult cases. And I think that what they say to us is that we can't depend on the Chauvin case as a template to resolve all these other cases. These other cases are going to be decided on their individual facts, and they are of course going to be decided in a historical context that we need to be suspicious of. But as Kamal has indicated, sometimes the facts are just not going to, they're not going to be sufficient to get the justice that you're looking for. Sometimes all that you can get is accountability, meaning an opportunity to at least have the state make the argument that should be made in the particular case, and to do so with the hope that a jury will at least fairly weigh the facts and render a decision. But sometimes the facts are going to be against you. As to the sentencing of Chauvin, the one thing that I would note is that while I agree that he is not going to get 40 years, the maximum, for the reasons that Clinton has pointed to, he's like first-time offender. I do think that there is a chance that the judge will impose an enhancement. This was a murder that was committed, as a law enforcement officer in the presence of a child, and committed over an extended period of time in a most aggravated circumstance. So there's at least a good chance that he will get an enhancement over and above the sentence that he would have gotten had or if the case was being decided simply as a first-time offender.
Listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. Again, I want to thank all of you. Kamal King from Atlanta, thank you, Brother Kamal. Good to see you again. Clinton Collins here in Twin Cities in Minneapolis, neighbor of mine and friend, thank you so much. And my first cousin, Professor Dean Burnell Venable Powell, joining us from South Carolina. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. It's rich and rewarding for me. If you look at Monday's edition of Insight News, you can get it at www.insightnews.com or go to issue.com/Insight News for a digital copy of the publication. You can read about one of our exchanges. We'll be publishing this exchange as well in future editions. I am so grateful to have you gentlemen to talk to. I think this is a rich conversation. I hope our audience will feel the same way. And perhaps we can do this again, sort of as a way, kind of a classroom. This is like, for me, it's a classroom. How do we explain the machinery of court, the machinery of justice, of law, in ways that is sensible and that reflects what we bring as a culture to the understanding. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. We'll see you next time. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. We'll see you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Morning draws near, I rise and say my prayer. Little piece of bread to my mouth, little tea to wash it out. It's my daily tribulation, even though I'm a working man. I work so hard to make soldier with one suit and one shoe to my feet. Days are getting so hard, yeah, but I got to keep on pushing on this 9 to 5, working to stay alive. On my 9 to 5, working till sun goes down. As the sun sets in the west, I pack my things and head on home, thinking about tomorrow's journey as I try these streets alone. It's my daily tribulation, oh yeah, searching for liberation, yeah. Got to step out of Babylon, take a step to Mount Zion. Days are getting so hard, yeah, but I got to keep on pushing on this 9 to 5, working to stay alive. Oh, on this 9 to 5, yeah, working till sun goes down, sun goes down. Oh, days are getting so hard, yeah, but I got to keep on pushing on this 9 to 5, working to stay alive. Oh, on this 9 to 5, working till sun goes down, sun goes down, sun goes on this 9 to 5, yeah, working to stay alive. Oh, on this 9 to 5, yeah, working till sun goes down. Oh Lord, got to keep working, got to keep working.